The Devil's Bible.
There is a book in Sweden so heavy it takes 2 grown men to lift it. It's 3 feet tall, nearly 2 feet wide, almost 9 inches thick. It weighs 165 pounds, about the size of a small adult human. Inside, sandwiched between the Old and New Testament, is a single full-page illustration, not of God, not of a saint, of the devil. Green skin, clawed hands stretched wide, 2 red tongues, eyes that, according to almost everyone who has stood in front of it, seem to follow you. For 800 years, people have whispered the same story about how this book was made. That a monk, sentenced to be sealed alive inside a wall, made a deal with Satan himself to save his own life. They call it the Devil's Bible. And whether or not you believe a demon held the pen, its real history is stranger than the legend. Let's start with what we know for certain, because the facts alone are unsettling enough. The book is officially called the Codex Gigas, Latin for giant book. Historians believe it was written in a Benedictine monastery in Podlajice, in the region of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, sometime in the early 13th century, likely between 1204 and 1230. It isn't just a Bible, it's more like a medieval hard drive. Alongside a complete Latin translation of the Old and New Testament, it contains a history of the Jewish people by the historian Josephus, a medieval encyclopedia by Isidore of Seville, medical texts and treatments for disease, a calendar, alphabets in Greek, Hebrew, and Slavic, a history of Bohemia, and, this is the part that gets people, magic formulas, incantations, and even instructions for exorcism, a Bible and a spellbook, bound together in the same 620 pages. Here's the number that should stop you. Scholars estimate that, working non-stop, it would take one scribe 5 years just to physically copy this much text by hand. And that's without the elaborate illustrations. Realistically, a single monk working normal hours would need around 25 years. And yet, from the very first page to the very last, the handwriting never changes. No shift in style, no sign of fatigue, illness, or aging. One consistent hand for what should have been a quarter of a century of labor. That single detail, a superhuman consistency across a superhuman task, is the seed the entire legend grew from. So here's the story monks were already telling within a couple of generations of the book's creation. There was a monk, some versions name him Herman. He broke his sacred vows. The specifics changed depending who's telling it, but the punishment was always the same: immurement. He was to be sealed alive inside the monastery wall and left there forever. As the final brick was about to be set in place, Herman begged the abbot for one chance at mercy. The abbot gave him an impossible offer: build a book. One book containing all human knowledge, every scrap of science, history, and scripture known to man. Complete it in a single night between sunset and sunrise. Succeed, and he'd walk free. Fail, and the wall would close anyway. By midnight, Herman realized what any of us would realize: it was not humanly possible. So, according to the legend, he did the only thing left. He got down on his knees, and instead of praying to God, he prayed to the one being who might actually help him meet the deadline. The devil appeared and made him an offer. I will finish this book for you before dawn. In return, you add my portrait to its pages, and you give me your soul." Herman agreed. The devil wrote through the night, and when the sun rose, the monastery gate opened to find the entire manuscript sitting complete. A full page near the center reserved for a life-sized portrait of the being who'd written it. That's the story. It's been repeated for 8 centuries, dramatized in documentaries, and it's the reason this book has a nickname at all. Here's the twist most retellings leave out. Modern historians think the legend itself is built on a mistranslation. The scribe's own signature appears in the manuscript. Hermanus Inclusus. Inclusus has been read as the imprisoned or the walled up, feeding the immurement story. But in actual medieval Latin, Inclusus far more commonly just meant an anchorite, a monk who voluntarily lived alone in a sealed cell, devoted to prayer and isolation. Not a prisoner, a hermit by choice. In other words, the horror story might have started as a simple word getting lost across 800 years of translation. Whatever the truth of who wrote it, the illustration is real, and it is the single most reproduced image from the entire manuscript. The devil is drawn alone, isolated on his own page, not surrounded by hellfire and demons like most medieval depictions of Satan. He's crouched, almost caged, inside a kind of architectural frame. Green skin, clawed hands spread wide on either side of his body, a crown or headdress, small red eyes, a long forked red tongue, and directly across from him, on the facing page, is an equally massive illustration of the heavenly city. Historians read this as deliberate, heaven and hell, bound into the same object, staring at each other across the spine for 800 years. Whether it's a warning, a theological statement, or, as some read it, almost a confession, is something no one has ever definitively settled. What we do know is that this page sits between 2 very specific sections of the book, a text on penitence and a text of exorcism formulas. Whoever placed that illustration there did it on purpose. Here's where it gets stranger. At some point in its history, nobody knows exactly when, 10 pages were cut out of the Codex Gigas. Not lost, not decayed, cleanly removed. The leading theory is that these pages once held the rule of Saint Benedict, a standard guide to monastic life that would have made sense in a book like this. Boring, in other words. But no one has ever found those pages. No one knows for certain what was actually written on them. And that gap, a deliberate physical wound in an 800-year-old book, is exactly the kind of blank space legend loves to fill. Some later stories claim the missing pages held something far darker, a lost ritual sometimes referred to online as the Devil's Prayer. I want to be straight with you here. There is no historical documentation that supports this. It shows up in blogs and paranormal roundups, not in any manuscript record or scholarly source. It's a modern addition to an old mystery, which doesn't make it less fun to talk about. It just means you should know the difference between the documented gap and the invented explanation for it. Now let's follow where this book actually went, because its physical journey across Europe reads like a curse, even if no one can prove it is one. The first solid historical record puts the Codex Gigas at the Podlages monastery. By 1295, records show the monastery was in financial trouble and had to pawn the book just to survive. It changed hands between monasteries multiple times over the next 2 centuries, and more than once, the institution that took possession of it fell into crisis shortly after. Then, in 1594, the book landed in the hands of a man tailor-made for this story. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, notorious across Europe for his obsession with alchemy, astrology, and the occult. Rudolf didn't just admire the Codex Gigas, he became fixated on it, adding it to a private collection full of occult manuscripts and curiosities. In the years following, Rudolf's reign grew increasingly erratic. His mental state deteriorated. Paranoia set in. Eventually, his own family moved to strip him of power. Officially, historians point to political pressure, war, and his own choices. But it's hard not to notice the pattern people can't stop pointing at. The moment the Devil's Book entered his life, his grip on reality and his throne started slipping. Then, in 1648, near the end of the brutal 30 Years' War, Swedish forces stormed Prague and looted the city's treasures, including Rudolf's entire library. The Codex Gigas was carried off to Stockholm as spoils of war, where it's remained, one way or another, ever since. Nearly 50 years after arriving in Sweden, the book almost didn't survive at all. On May 7, 1697, a massive fire tore through the royal castle in Stockholm, where the manuscript was being kept. As flames spread through the library, someone made a split-second decision that's now part of the legend forever. Rather than try to carry the 165-pound book out through burning corridors, they threw it out of a window. The fall shattered its binding and tore out several pages. But the book survived the fire that destroyed much of the rest of the collection around it. To believers in the curse, that's the whole story right there. Throw the Devil's Book out a window, and it still comes out the other side intact. To historians, it's simpler. The manuscript's massive size and thick wooden and leather binding likely just made it structurally tough enough to survive a fall that would have destroyed a normal book. Either way, it's now sitting in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm, where it has remained on public and digital display for well over a century, seemingly undisturbed by whatever it's supposed to carry. Here's the part I want to handle carefully, because this is where documented history stops and internet legend takes over. And I think you deserve to know the difference. You will find stories online claiming that a librarian was once accidentally locked in a room with the Codex Gigas overnight in the 1800s and found the next morning having lost his mind, describing books flying off the shelves and swirling around the manuscript before he blacked out. I searched for a primary source on this. I couldn't find one. No library record, no newspaper account, no named institution confirms it happened. It appears to originate from a handful of paranormal blogs, retelling each other's version of the same uncredited story. That doesn't necessarily mean it's false. Old institutional records get lost. But as it stands today, there is no verifiable documentation behind it. Treat it as modern folklore, not history. What is real? Visitors to this day report the same reaction standing in front of that devil illustration, a genuine physical unease. Some describe it as feeling watched. Some say they get a headache staring at it too long. Psychologists would probably tell you that's the power of suggestion, scale, and 800 years of build-up doing exactly what it's designed to do. But if you've ever stood in front of something that big, that old, and that deliberately made to unsettle you, you understand why the feeling doesn't need to be supernatural to be real. Strip away the devil-packed story, and here's what nobody, not historians, not paleographers, not the National Library of Sweden itself, has ever definitively answered: who actually wrote it. We have a name, Herman, but no confirmed identity, no biography, no proof he existed outside his own signature in the book. Why one person would take on a 25-year project alone, in an era when major manuscripts were normally split among teams of scribes to save time. What was on the 10 missing pages? Genuinely gone, genuinely undocumented. Why a devil illustration this large and this isolated was placed in a Bible, of all books, when nothing else like it exists anywhere else in medieval manuscript history? That's the real hook of the Codex Gigas. It's not that a demon definitely wrote it. It's that 8 centuries of scholarship still can't fully explain how or why a human did. The Codex Gigas sits in Stockholm right now, behind glass, fully digitized, available for anyone in the world to flip through online. You can look the devil in the eye from your phone tonight if you want to. Just maybe don't do it alone at midnight with the lights off.